Welcome to The One Inside, an internal family systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sollenberger. I'm excited that you and all of your parts have taken time to be with me and all of my parts. If you are a coach, a client, a therapist, if you are in business or education, and you're curious about the IFS model, you are in the right place. Now, let's see what happens on today's podcast. Hey everyone, on today's episode, I talk with Tom Holmes. Tom is the author of Parts Work, an illustrated guide to your inner life. He's been in the IFS world since the early days, and he teaches IFS, or what he refers to as parts work, internal systems therapy, or integrated internal systems therapy all over the world. We talk about his story, which is fascinating. We talk about his history with IFS and his passion for integrating spirituality and IFS. That's what his next book is going to be about, and that's where we spend most of our time. What I wanted to tell you in this introduction, I want to tell you a couple of things. One is the power of these parts cards. So I think Tom says there's 30 in the deck, and I want you to know that I use these parts cards in my work. When clients were coming to my office, which they're not anymore, but when they would often use these cards, and I love them. And so I just want to tell you a couple of different ways that I use them. One way is to have a client walk in my office and just go through the pile and just pick out whatever card speaks to them. It could be something that represents something, a current problem, something that makes them smile, and they will just pick out a couple, and maybe they say they pick out 10, and then they place them down on the table, and they just sort of talk through what means what to them, because they're all these beautiful pictures, and they all mean something different to everyone that picks them up. It's kind of amazing. So then the thing that's so interesting too is they always pick a card that represents self. It's incredible. They talk through it, and then we find patterns, and we find parts that are connected and parts that are related to each other and parts that react to one another. And we always, if they don't have it down on the table, which they almost always do, I can always say, okay, well, why not, I'll hand them the deck back and say, well, why don't you pick another card that says critical of that one? It's fascinating, and they'll end up with this really cool pattern, and it's really wild. So I love doing that. The other thing I love doing is just pulling a card. So sometimes it's best to like set an intention, or like kind of have a wondering about something. A friend that works down the hall from me will come into my office sometimes and say, can we just pull cards? And I'm like, sure. And that's another thing that's super wild is we'll pull cards, and often, like I often will pull the same cards, and she'll often pull the same cards. And sometimes it's just a real encouragement. Sometimes it's a bit of a challenge, but it always speaks to me. I love these cards. They've really impacted my life. And I was super excited to get to talk to Tom. And I don't think we talk about the cards a little bit, but I just want you to know the power of these cards. If you want to go to his website is wingedheart.org. You can buy his book and you can get the cards. Tom is also available to do intro to IFS classes for groups and for organizations. That's what he does all over the world. He has videos on his website. So he has one video that my son and I love. He has inside out puppets, and he uses the puppets, the inside out characters, and he uses the puppets to talk about COVID and talk about fears. And my son and I have watched that a couple of times, and we love that. He also has 3 videos with his wife, Lauri, and he wrote the book together. And they pull cards. So it's a third way of using the cards is they pull cards around parts of them that are reacting to COVID, and then parts of them that can be a resource for them. And so there's 3 videos on his website that are fantastic. I listened to the video and pulled cards along with them. And so I'm going to share a video on my Instagram page at IFS Tammy and on the One Inside Facebook page sometime probably next week on the video of the cards that I pulled and what that means for me, and just sort of show you how that works for me. And then you can see the cards in both videos. So I will take another couple of weeks off. This is the only episode I'm releasing in August. I'll be back for season 2 the first week of September. I can't wait. Stay connected with me, keep in touch, and enjoy this episode with Tom.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right. So, how do you want to get this thing rolling?
Well, how I like to start is by just asking if you were to look out your nearest window,
Right.
what would you see? Yeah, and it just
Yeah.
orients people to where you are and tell everybody like where you are in the world too.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It's a town of about 80,000 and metropolitan area of 200,000. We live on the edge of town. So I look out my back window and I see trees, woods. We have a wooded area. And right now I don't see any deer, but often there are deer come up there and various wildlife. So it's a really cool spot. And on the other side of us is a lake and a natural preserve that my wife spends a lot of time defending from
Mm.
development. So she's a real ecology activist as well
Mm.
as social activist. So
Yeah. How long have you been married?
we'll be about 45 years.
Wow. Do
Yeah.
you have a secret to being married that long and you have a big smile on your face. So my guess is you're
Yeah.
happily
Sorry. Yeah.
married.
You mentioned it. Well, chapter 6 in our book, we really wrote together, and it talks about how we worked with some of our loops that we get into and what we call the Z, where we kind of end up, in patterns of relationships. So, she's a social worker, clinical social worker, and family therapist. So the fact that we both, have those areas. It was maybe hard for our kids who had to grow up with psychologist parents and psychotherapist parents. So it's worked. It's been good.
Did you have family dinners where everyone shared their feelings?
Well, actually, our son was probably had to work very hard not to have his brain picked all the time when we were at the table. So, yeah. So I think we tried to avoid a too intrusive of things. Kind of let it be a natural family process rather than let our psychotherapist parts come too deep into the family dynamics.
It's hard though because I don't know if when I'm okay, so I was in the car with my son and our neighbor, little girl, they're around the same age, and I asked it was her last day of school, and so I was like, "Well, how are you feeling about your last day of school?" Because they both are
Sure.
doing remote learning, and I'm thinking I'm asking from my mom. I'm asking as a mom, like, "How are you
Right.
doing?" And then both of them, it was so cute. Like they're both having a conversation about they were feeling sad. And my son said, I started crying during the Zoom meeting today. And I was like, this is great. They're having a conversation. And then I asked another, I think, innocent mom question. And my son says, this isn't a therapy group.
That's right. That's right.
And I
That's
was
right.
like, yeah. And this is not the first time he said something like that to me. But I'm like, I think
Yeah.
I'm just asking these questions as a mom. Like, how are you feeling?
Right, right, right. Yeah. A mom may be informed with the therapist part.
Right. Well, I like to talk about feelings. So,
That's
I mean,
right.
come
Hey, there
on.
you go. You did that before you were a therapist, right?
I
So, of
did, yes.
course,
That's
yes.
right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah, so it's funny. Did you guys meet in school?
Actually, we met. She hired in my first job.
Mm-mm.
So I was just getting back from Europe, where I had been for a year and a half studying in my undergraduate. I just had graduated and was visiting some friends at the campus, and a friend came and told me about a job in this small town in rural Michigan. And my wife was doing her MSW, and she had a field placement in drug abuse prevention. And I interviewed for the job and got it. And one of her famous stories is that she always says in the meeting when they were trying to decide who to hire, she says, "Well, I think we should hire Tom Holmes because he's on his way somewhere else." And those are sort of famous last words because I travel probably 3-4 months a year doing my international work. And so I said,
Wow.
"Well, you knew when you met me, this was what you
This
were
is the
getting
life.
into."
Yeah. He's on
So
his
maybe that's one of
way.
the keys too,
Wow.
that we both respect each other's life, her professional life, my
Mm,
professional life. So I think that's one of the reasons why we can be together and support each other as well as we do.
you're respectful of your professional work.
Yeah.
And so you retired from being a professor. Tell me
Right.
about that.
Well, it's just you were looking a little bit at my history, and I was, how I got into being a professor was also, I mean, I was trained in I have 2 master's degrees, an MSW and MA in clinical psych, PhD in counseling psych. And I was trained in, cognitive behavioral, client-centered, Gestalt, all this stuff from the 70s and ego psych in my doctorate and object relations theory. But I really enjoyed teaching. And that's the reason I actually went back and got the PhD, is because I wanted to teach. And I just love training people. So I've been at the university training therapists probably for 20 years before I retired early to
Mm.
do that. So it was one of my loves. And an interesting part of how I got to the IFS side was I had been doing all of this training, and I was working in community mental health. One of the good things that I feel about me as a teacher is I had 10 years of experience in community mental health before I ever entered the university. So I knew what worked and what didn't, what was just a theory that was kind of nice, but really it's not very useful,
Right.
so,
Yeah.
but still I was working part-time in a community mental health agency, or still seeing clients while I was teaching. But I just felt like what I wasn't making a big enough difference. I had
Mm.
all these models, all these theories. I was a good therapist. All the feedback I got was a good therapist, but it wasn't enough. I felt
Mm.
like I was still burning out. So I would go to therapy and talk, and all the different models I was trained in, I would go get those therapy. What's wrong with me that I can't be content with the amount that I can offer? So I have to adjust my own system to the realities of the
Wow.
little difference we can make. And I was ready to stop being a psychotherapist altogether. And I was really considering teaching just developmental psychology like I do, and those kinds of things. And my wife comes home from a conference, the Networker Conference in Washington, D.C., and had seen this workshop by Richard Schwartz. And she says, Tom, I think this is really a really good thing for you. I think you'll really like this model. I said, not one more model. I've been trained in all these models. I am tired. I don't want to do it. And besides that, this sounds a little weird.
Yes.
Parts, really? Are you
Yeah.
kidding? Really, is
Yeah.
this going to happen?
Yeah.
So, but she kept with it, and she signed me up for it and dragged me over to Dick's workshop in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I sat there for the first half hour, still a little skeptical, and then gradually started to make sense. And a few weeks later, I was traveling to Chicago to his training group and spent a couple of years training with Dick. It was a very small group at IJR, the Institute for Juvenile Research, and
And
yeah,
what
ever
ye so
since.
what year was that, ish?
That was in the late 80s,
Okay,
so
okay,
a little over 30 years ago.
okay. So you did this one workshop with him, and then a few weeks later, you were
Well, I was
that
lucky. He had an open training group. It wasn't like this formal training with a beginning and an end. He had a small group of about 5 or 6 people, as I recall, and we just sit in this small room and watch videotapes, and he would tell us what he was doing and what the
wow,
model was. But that was before there was any formal training,
gotcha.
right? So,
But you must have been that like, for you to commit that much or something must have really
well, something clicked. And then after, one of the first things I did was, since I was still trying to decide if I was going to be a therapist or not, and I kind of just at that point jettisoned my Jungian analyst who I'd been working with for 2 years, and it wasn't working. I
wow.
still wanted to quit being a
Yeah.
therapist. I went to an IFS therapist who had been training 1 year by then. Right?
Wow, right, because it was
And
so new, right? So,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So there was hardly anybody who was really doing the work. So she was
yeah.
another person in the training, actually. I said, could I work with you? And after 3 or 4 sessions, I found some really key dynamics to what was burning me out. And I was
Mm,
able to, and I knew those dynamics all along from my head, right? But there's something about the parts work
mm,
that changes things in a totally different way. And
mm,
I began to feel a real release from some of those burdened children exiles that were
mm,
carrying things into the therapy session.
mm.
And I was beginning to be able to release those and to work. And so here we are 30 some years later, and I'm still doing this work.
And you're
So
not burned out, and you're
no,
doing
I'm
amazing
energized by
things.
the work. Yeah,
Wow,
I'm energized
wow.
by the work.
You did that with Dick in the '80s,
Right.
and then you're
So then I started
teaching.
doing training at the
Okay.
university, and I was so enthusiastic about it. I ran to every agency in town. Let me demonstrate this. Joe, you want to work on it? You got a problem? Let me see a problem. Boom, boom, boom. And we're doing this parts work, and people are going, holy cow. how did he get there? And
Wow.
in 15 minutes we're getting to this. And so I was a little
Yeah.
crazy. I was so
Passionate.
enthusiastic and passionate about the work. And then I was trying to teach it to my students in a lecture format, and I thought, this isn't working.
Mm,
You need to experience it. I thought you have to experience it, and I thought, well, how can I teach this in a lecture way so that people can get it? Because I only learned it from Dick through this interactive process with him, and
mm,
through my own experience, and through teaching. I could teach it to other therapists through the experiential model, but teaching it to students, that wasn't working. And then I had the idea of using pictures, and I started using pictures, and I had all my students make inner maps of their inner system. And one student was Sharon Eckstein, who did the art in our book, and she did this amazing drawing of her system. I said, "Can you do more of those?" And she said, "Sure." So we collaborated on all these pictures, and I developed a PowerPoint. Well, once I had that PowerPoint, I could, in 5 or 10 minutes, people got the model. It was just boom,
mm.
boom, 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 right? And then people said, "Well, can't you write this down?" Right? And I said, "Well, sure." So then, after I retired from the university, Lauri and I got together and finished up the book I'd been working on for eternity.
Yeah.
It seemed like, anyway.
Yeah.
Uh, and the book came out, and then and I was giving lectures all over the world with this, and people said, "Wow, but there should be cards about the parts." And I said to Sharon, I says, "Could you make some cards?" And she thought, yeah, maybe not, And then she decided to do it, and it allowed her to really create her own cards. So those cards, those interactive cards that you see, those are her creative thing, not
Mm,
mine. Right? They
mm,
come out of her, and all the nuances she's added to those cards are come out of her. And
mm,
it was really only through her that this whole thing took on such a momentum. So I feel really graced that
mm.
we've had this, and the fact that Lauri and I and Sharon all could create this book, and that
Yeah.
now it seems to have legs. It keeps going. So
Yeah.
it's a real blessing in my life.
I was thinking of the universal appeal of these pictures and that just
Yeah.
draws people to, and it sounds like you were listening inside and you knew that your students needed something different.
They needed something different, and I do think that Sharon has some kind of a universal grasp of archetypes. I mean, she is into the Jungian stuff, and she was an artist, and before she became a therapist, she was an artist, and she had an immune disorder that didn't allow her to work with the oil paints anymore. So
Wow.
she had to give up that part of her art, became a therapist, and that's why I was training her in my holistic health classes.
Wow.
And and then, but I think she says she does a meditation, and she has these images just come to her, and then boom, they're out. So
Yeah.
I think there's some kind of deep intuition that she's able to tap into.
I mean, there must be something, and I know you and I talked before, but there's something really special and weird about these cards.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
mean, people will pull, even if they'll just pull a card in my office, it'll be exactly what they need to hear, or it'll be like, wait, this is how I was feeling, and I wasn't able to describe it. There's been some very interesting using them as maps. Like people will map them out, and I'll just say, like, pick which cards really resonate with you, and they'll pick 10 cards, and then we'll be able to use those cards and map their systems out in a way that they would have never been able to do.
It's
It's just,
amazing. It's
it is
amazing how
amazing.
much you can achieve in such a short period. I always do that on my first real day of my workshops. I just have people work with the cards after I give a little my lecture, and I don't care what part of the world I'm in. Wow, it hits. And some of the cards, there's some cultural limitations of the cards, and I've always been
Mhm.
working with hoping people could make a more diverse group of cards that would be ethnically more diverse. And we have artists in the refugee camp in Jordan that I work in who have created a whole set of cards for the Middle East, and especially for
Wow.
the refugee experience. So we have a whole nother set of cards that I could use in my work with training therapists who work with refugees.
Wow.
But it turns out those cards also have universal appeal, and they're selling like crazy in Germany. So um,
That's amazing. That's
it's.
amazing.
But Sharon's have a very special quality to them that whether it's in Korea or Egypt or Eastern Europe or Western Europe, and uh, yeah, so
Amazing.
that's
So You just sort of just talked about it a little bit, but I want to hear about this international work. So you were a professor and then you wrote
Yeah,
this
well,
book.
so when I was in Europe as an undergrad, that was largely because I wasn't, this was in the 60s, right? And I was in a rather conservative private school and I didn't fit. So because I didn't fit, I thought I needed to travel. And I had been a summer in Sweden and I had got a rather activist social justice orientation at that point, and that wasn't represented in the school I was in.
Mm,
And so I managed to go to Europe and live for a year and a half, study some of the time, some of the time not, but doing what you do at 19 and 20 years old when you have freedom, and at that time especially.
in the
Um,
60s, yeah.
in the 60s, and that's why, and that sort of seeded this international interest of mine,
Mm,
right? So when I came home, it went kind of dormant as I started training myself as a psychologist. And then really the whole thing turns also on the fact of the whole way spirituality came into my work. And that's really why I left the university. It wasn't so much to do the international work, it was to have the freedom to integrate spirituality and the parts work. And that's my real passion. If there's a passion in my life, that's it.
mm, mm.
And I remember this client that I had. This was well before parts work, 10 years before parts work. I was doing one of my doctoral internships, and I had these clients with these spiritual issues, and I didn't know what to do about them. We had not studied spirituality at all in any of my graduate programs. And I thought, and they had strong belief, but they were alienated from their belief. So I
Mm,
somehow showed up at this agency, a workshop, spirituality and counseling. That sounds good. And given by Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan, Sufi master. And I thought, what the heck is a Sufi master, right? And what a strange name. But I like the spirituality and counseling idea, so I'm going to go there.
yeah.
Well, it really changed my life because what he did was he introduced me to a universalist path of spirituality. I had kind of left the Christian church because it seemed way too narrow to me and way too defined. I knew there was more than one way of experiencing spiritual truth. And this showed me a path that respected all religions and helped them to try and be centered in their heart. And that the heart of the religion could be discovered. And the spiritual teacher's job was to help people find their path, whether it was a Buddhist path, a Christian path, an Islamic path, a path of Gaia path, whatever the paths were, right?
Mm,
So that appealed to me, and somehow I got a lot of energy from that. And I went back and I started working with this woman, and she had been depressed for years and no medication was working, therapy wasn't working. She had psoriasis all over her skin. It was a real sort of dead end sort of case, one of those ones where you just sit there and you say, well, I'll be with you as you suffer, and I'll
yeah.
go along. And so, but then I started asking her about her spiritual beliefs, and it turns out she was a very devout Catholic, but she had been sexually abused by her priest. Well, so that had blocked off a whole source of healing for her. So
Oh,
we began to work with the belief system, and I managed to find a saint of sexually abused women, right? And this saint was somebody that she could pray to. And what we did in the therapy was to form questions. She would go home and pray. And my goodness, in 3 to 6 weeks, not only did her depression lift, but her psoriasis went away. I mean, it was like I had been doing therapy already for 6 or 8 years, and I had never seen anything like that. And I thought, I don't know what that was, but it's a powerful source of energy, and I would like to know how to use it. But I
wow.
was, trained in traditional psychotherapy, and you didn't bring that in. And I was working in community mental health. It was a government program. It wasn't a church
Mm,
program. So that kind
mm,
of went on the back burner. But I started also realizing I needed to deepen my own spiritual life. So I began on a path of my own spiritual development at that point,
mm,
knowing that someday, somehow, spirituality would become an important part of the work that I do.
mm.
But
Wow.
that didn't work theoretically until I learned the parts work model. And then what happened was it didn't have to be theoretical anymore, because, as the person begins to come into the self, as they get centered in self, often their spiritual life just awakens and deepens.
Mm, mm,
And Dick was talking about these things that he was calling guides, and this was already there in the early 80s, a part of the experience. But I must say he didn't talk about that very much for a long, long time, because he said, well, look, people think I'm kooky enough. If I start
Yeah.
talking about guides and this kind of thing, then I'll miss a lot of people who would otherwise be able to benefit a lot from the work. And I hear that from in Germany, where I teach, the IFS that's taught is often completely absent of spirituality.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and that's one of the roles that I have in Europe is a spirituality and the IFS parts work together. And that's
Mm.
my particular niche in the world.
Mm. And is there I'm guessing there's a reason why in Germany it's more closed off.
Well, in Germany, there's a long tradition in the universities that psychology is kept separate from any kind of spiritual things, and there were a few professors that would do that, but there's nothing like in the United States, where, especially starting in the '90s, spirituality became a part of the understanding of health as part of holistic health, right? That was a dimension, body, mind, spirit, was accepted in many circles as a
Right.
reality of people's life that was
Right.
important to tend to.
So you were teaching and you were noticing that this spirituality is not being considered, and that's something that you were feeling really passionate about. And like that's something that I want to teach and I want to spread.
Yeah, and instead of in the university, you have to go with where they need teachers, and
Okay.
I ended up teaching some undergrads and not just grads, and I realized I was most valuable for people who already had therapeutic experience,
Okay.
and for people to bring in to that both the spiritual and the internal systems model to
Mhm.
their work. So um, I realized that's what I wanted to do. And I also had some spiritual experiences, where it could be a whole nother interview, that said to me, well, I don't know if you know, one of the things that I do is, well, all right.
No, no, no. I'm like, no, 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 go ahead.
Well, no, there's a whole, what happened was I began to have some things in my 50s where I started experiencing a spiritual energy that I had never experienced before.
Mm,
And I will call it like an experience that really awakened my heart in a much bigger way than it had ever been. And
mm,
I wanted to find a way for that to be the thing that guided my life. And I knew that if I were to die at that point in my life, I was about 55, that my soul would feel like it hadn't done that which I was here for.
wow.
So at 57, I left the university and started just saying, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to go out and just follow my heart and follow what I have to offer. And I
Mm,
feel very grateful that there has been a place in the world that will receive that.
mm,
And that I already had started working with a clinic in Germany that was integrating spirituality and psychotherapy in the late 90s. So
mm.
I had a place to go to begin to share that. And gradually, as there were enough people who were interested in this kind of little bit strange professor from America, who was integrating spirituality and psychotherapy and doing peace dances and meditation and things like that. Right.
Peace dances.
Peace dances, it's a meditative circle dance. Some people know them as Sufi dances, dances
Okay.
of universal peace, they're called. And like I usually will start my circles with the Shabbat Shalom dance, where we welcome in the peace of rest of the Sabbath, and I'll often end them that day maybe with an Assalamu Alaikum, peace be with you and with you be peace. So an Islamic dance and a Jewish dance, both touching the peacefulness in both of those traditions. So
Mm,
that's what these peace dances are all about. They're about finding the peaceful teachings in the world's religions and emphasizing those and using those to bring people together.
wow.
Right.
Well, because
So
you're teaching in so many different cultures.
that's right. That's right. That's right. And so I can draw on many different cultures of dances. So dances from all various religious and cultural traditions around the world.
Mm,
So you
mm,
might do a beauty way dance from the Navajo tradition,
mm,
or a Krishna dance from India, right?
Hmm.
Or something like that. So it depends on the energy that you want to invite into the room, and how open people are to the various religious traditions, trying not to tread on people's feet, but
Yeah.
at the same time offer something. What I like about them is that we're in a circle together, singing together, moving together in a very peaceful kind of meditative way. And it's a very holistic way of being together. Right.
Hmm.
So I do that before, and it's watering the seeds of self, is what I would say. The whole group self arises in that context. So then the next morning when we wake up and start doing the inner work, it's held in this self energy that's very solid and deep. And that anytime we need to get back to it, I can do another one of those, or that we can just sing together in a certain way. Or so I use that to tune the groups.
Watering the seeds of self.
Yeah, watering the seeds of self, and that's what I see meditation as. I mean, it's like how Thich Nhat Hanh talked about. We all have these gardens of the different potential ego states, the states of mind, the different parts, and what we can do is we can nourish or water the seeds of the states of mind that we would like to have be the main part of our inner garden.
Hmm.
And so I just have studied religious traditions to see which ones awaken the kind of consciousness that in IFS is called self. And I call it the heart, really. If you look at it, it's the heart or the heart mind.
So, okay, I did hear you say the heart, and I thought, okay, so when you refer to self, you often call it heart.
Right. It's that center of compassion. It's the core of our being.
Hmm.
Right. So the heart is often means core. And I like to use the Chinese or Asian phrase for heart, which is like heart mind. It's something together. It's not just like sometimes heart means just emotion in the Western language structure,
Right.
but there's a spiritual heart is really that has those qualities: compassion, curiosity, has all those qualities in the First Corinthians 13 of not only kindness and patience, but it's also endurance, the capacity to be with
Mm.
suffering. And to me, nourishing the heart and helping the heart to awaken to that place where the symbol for our group is a winged heart, right? That's
Oh,
what I have.
wow.
My website is called wingedheart.org, and the wings of the heart are equanimity and compassion, right? Or
Mm.
equanimity and non-attachment. So that if we have our heart present in the therapy without a certain peace, a deep peacefulness, then it's hard to be with the suffering. We just feel the injuries, we feel the kind of emotional empathy. But if our heart is centered in this peaceful, compassionate place, we're present with it. The pain, it's not like we don't feel it. It touches us, but it doesn't take us over in
Yeah.
the same way,
Which
right? So
leads to
it's
burnout.
right, and that's why I love to use IFS mixed together with spirituality to do burnout prevention for all kinds of healthcare workers.
Okay.
Right? It's a very powerful method because you can work with the parts that are working too hard, the parts that are overactive, the parts that are
Mm.
anxious or scared or over responsible,
Mm.
and when we take care of those parts and let them know that to really trust the self to take care of the, or they're working from their therapist parts all the time, and that therapist can get overburdened, and that part needs to inform what we're doing, but they need not to be in the center of the process.
I love
Right.
that. I love that. And in when you're talking, whether you're talking to healthcare workers and doing, burnout prevention, or you're talking to refugees,
Right.
do you find that there are some common experiences because of spirituality?
Well, because I've studied so many world traditions, when I went to the Middle East, I had studied the Islamic tradition quite a bit, and I could begin to when I could begin to both tie into this the deep wisdom that is present in Islamic psychology, and I was able to kind of actually for many people kind of remind them or help bring into the foreground how this teaching and this by this Islamic teacher actually is just like parts work. And there's an
Mm,
Islamic teacher from 1,000 years ago. In fact, a lot of the Sufi teachers talked about the different parts of ourselves
wow.
and how we needed to not have the system led by those parts, but led by the heart, which is the self. So, I mean, they were basically saying self-led systems, 1,000 years
Wow.
ago.
Wow. Well, and
And
that gives you like a buy-in.
exactly, exactly that they feel they sense when you really respect their tradition and a sense that you are working, and even if whenever we try to do that, we're going to say stupid things and be culturally insensitive at times. But if you do it with an honest sincerity, they really appreciate the fact that you're working to respect and understand their culture. And in the Middle East, actually, it's easy. They had the first mental hospitals in the world there back in the 8th century, right? When we were still stoning people and burning them at the stake who were often schizophrenic or psychotic, they had a diagnostic system that differentiated between psychosis and neurosis. They had 4 different types of neurosis that are very similar to our models now. That was Bhakti, a guy called Bhakti, or Bhakti, and he uh, um, basically understood what we understand now 1,000 years later, or more than 1,000 years later. So, but they also went retrograde and lost some of that knowledge, right? So, and some of the traditions didn't bring that forward or didn't see it as psychology. They emphasized the religious side of it and not the psychological side of it.
Mm.
So part of it for me is now I have a wonderful group of people in Cairo that I'm working with, psychiatrists that are young and enthusiastic and bright and well trained, and um, I'm helping them or supporting them in finding the model of mental health that's right for their system, and
Mm.
really trying to encourage them not to buy our pathology-based model, not to just swallow that,
Yeah.
right? And that's what I
Why?
like about parts work, is that it's not pathology-based.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a sense of why we, in general, want to keep psychology here and spirituality separate?
Well, certainly the psychoanalytic people. That was when I first went to Eastern Europe. After one of the first times I started the international work, I went. It was when the fall of the Iron Curtain, and you could go into communist countries, formerly communist countries. And the guys I worked with there were had studied Freud and were trained Freudians, the psychologists in the Czech Republic, at least, and had bought a lot of that idea that this was more like a neurosis. Religion was a
Mm.
neurosis, right?
Okay.
It was not only that it wasn't, um, uh, valued. It wasn't seen, as it was seen as problematic,
Mm.
um, and also with the many of the Marxist ideology was the opiate of the masses. So it was also something that allowed people to be oppressed. And all those things can be true. I mean, religion can be a neurotic thing, and it can be a form of oppression. So those are all true as well.
Mm.
Um, but so it got put into the models there that you leave up spirituality for the priests and the ministers, and psychology is for the psychologist, and then a lot of the models that were most exported around the world from the West are psychodynamic, psychoanalytic model first, and then the cognitive behavioral. Well, the cognitive behavioral are not exactly, for the most part, into spirituality. And recently they've embraced mindfulness,
Mm.
often trying to do that without the spirituality in it. Um,
Mm.
so that was the two things that they came over. So psychologists who were trained in these non-Western cultures, if they wanted to be like the Western people that were getting all of the sort of praise,
Got
then
it.
they would keep that separate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Because even mindfulness, it's almost like they're trying to strip it. It's become this secular, it's being stripped
exactly.
of its spirituality, or even meditation is
Yeah,
being stripped of its
yeah,
spirituality
yeah, yeah,
components.
yeah. It's a type of neuroregulation.
Mm. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, they will call, you're just regulating the neurological process,
Got it. Got
right?
it. Okay. Yeah. Well, and I feel like we know that
Which,
something different is I mean, so there's part of that's true, but it feels like there's something different happening.
and there's something about yeah, there is something else happening, right? And that's a difficult thing to talk about, what that other something else is. right? So
Okay.
you can reference it when you experience it, and that's why I don't talk about it so much. I just do things with people and say, well, notice how you feel when we do that. So we just sang the word for
Yeah.
peace in Hebrew for 15 minutes,
Yeah.
and now how do you feel together after that? And you notice it. You don't have to
Right.
say, oh, here but it's like, here we're tapping into a tradition that for thousands of years has used this word to awaken this feeling,
Mm.
you know and so
Mm.
let's use that wisdom that has come down through the ages that helps us to tune the states of consciousness that we're in.
I wonder if that's why I'm going to back you like way up, but I wonder if that's why, partly why the cards are so powerful, because there are parts of us that either we want to explain the model or our clients want us to explain the model. And when we use the cards, it takes us, we don't have to do that. It's,
Yeah, I think, yeah, because the cards take us out of our kind of left brain analytical side of
yeah,
thinking, where we're
yeah,
organizing everything kind of that way. And we open it up to this broader way of thinking, this intuitive, broad, bigger gestalt way of thinking. And then a whole lot more information can come through in a hurry.
yeah,
Like they
yeah,
say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So that's a lot of words. A
yeah.
thousand words.
Well, and the other thing about those cards is that they can mean different things to different people. Like I've
Yeah.
had people pick the same cards and have completely different understandings or explanations or meaning from the same card.
And that's a really important thing when using them. And it's one of the things I like about parts work in general, IFS, the way Dick brought it into the world, is that we also don't label people's parts like in voice dialogue. You have the like 11 major parts that you're looking for, the critic, the, anger, all the different parts. In this model, it's more notice them, get to know them, and what do they want to be called, right? Or the
Mm,
person can name them, but they're not like standardized parts. And obviously, there are some parts that are so standardized, like the inner critic, that
right,
people are going to do that and
right.
work with that.
But if I'm a therapist and that would keep me in my head. If I was looking for if I was mapping it that way, then that would keep me in my
Absolutely,
head.
absolutely, and the images begin to move us away from, especially if once the people really trust the fact that you don't have a preset meaning for that card. Because
Yeah.
some people will ask, well, was that the right meaning, or
Yes,
did I
right.
get it right? It's like
Or they look on
that's
the back for the name of the
yeah.
card.
Well,
Well,
what
what's the
was
name
that?
of the yeah. What's this card? Yeah.
Exactly, and then they begin to trust themselves more through the process. And
Mm,
again, I think that's another beauty of the IFS model, the parts work model, is that you really begin to allow the person to direct their process
mm.
in more than any other model that I am
Well,
aware
and
of.
I think there's something so powerful about that because they leave your office or the Zoom call
Yeah,
nowadays,
right.
right? They leave and they all of a sudden have this just by, well, they have self-leadership and they have that feeling or that experience of, oh, I know, so when you ask them, what would you say to that part or what could you, and you sort of strengthen the you or you strengthen the heart space, they
Yeah,
walk out or they leave that with a different experience probably than they've ever had before. Like,
they
oh,
know that
I
that's
can,
coming from them.
yeah.
And actually, it's very interesting. The research shows that when the person experiences themselves as the primary agent of what shifted in them, it lasts so much longer, right?
Wow,
So it's
wow.
nice to have research support those things.
Yeah, right, right.
Just like research supports the importance of therapeutic qualities, 50% of the change is predicted by the therapeutic relationship, right? Which
Mm,
is really, if you look at it, it's the therapist being in self and
right.
being, you know,
Right, because if I'm telling, because I definitely have parts that like to be wise and like to be like, well, let me tell you, let me
exactly.
lecture you in your therapy session, then that could hurt the relationship, and it's not coming from them.
Exactly. And that's one of the hardest things when I'm training people is to get them to step back from knowing what's going on. Right? They want
Yes,
to map. They
yes,
want to know, well, what's, and it's like we
yeah,
don't have to know. We need to have a pathway and learn how to guide people along the pathway, but you don't know exactly where it's going, because one person's monster part will lead in this direction and another person's monster part will go in a totally different direction.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. There is something about not knowing and how to sit. It's almost like a sitting back,
Yeah.
like sitting back and then opening up my heart, like literally doing that physically so that I can walk them through and I'm not leaning forward and teaching
And
in a
that's
teaching space.
that's that's the winged heart space that I'm talking about, the sort of equanimity and non-attachment to us being the ones who know, right, and not
Yeah.
attached to but we have a deep confidence that if we stay in that space it will go where it needs to go.
Mm.
Right?
Are there other cultures where knowing, where because of what they've had the legacy burdens that they need to know, they need to sit in knowing or have an anchor in knowing?
Well, I think you need to know how to help people negotiate certain things that are happening. For example, like the legacy burden thing, and one of the things that's not talked about a lot in some of the IFS work is the parts that are not parts of the system. For example, there are things that have come into the system from the outside and they're acting a little bit like parts, and the person might even think that they're the part of them, but they're really not in the process. And I think it's good that it's not emphasized too much, because otherwise people would be casting out all kinds of any kind of unpleasant part. No, I don't want that one. That one's gone.
That's not mine. Yeah.
So I'm writing another book now that integrates spirituality and the parts work, and a couple of the chapters are going to be on ways that I work with helping people who have picked up parts that come from certain legacies. And um, there was an amazing video of Eduardo Duran, who's a Native American psychologist, and he talks about soul wounds in a way that perfectly described those types of experiences, that the wound is a little bit different. And I was so delighted. I saw this just a couple of weeks ago. I was so excited to see it, because he was saying why the native people are often so unable to heal from the Western methods,
Mm.
right? And he said because the wounds are at a different level, and there's energies that the person has picked up through some of the legacy burdens that have been cast upon the people. There's a story. I had one woman who was raised by parents who were Nazis, and who had been concentration camp workers. I mean, they had been, doing the bad stuff there, and they raised her in the same way. If she was bad, they would lock her into a cage in the basement, and if she did anything weird, she was just locked away. Could be for a week down there. When we were working, we were doing the kind of regular parts work, and working with some of her Buddhist beliefs, and and I had not mentioned that there are sometimes parts in the system that don't belong to the system, and then they need to be released. And she came up to me after I had mentioned that in a lecture, and she had been in my groups for some time, and I had been reluctant to talk about this, so I wasn't talking about it. She says, "Tom, I think I have some of these."
Mm.
And so we sat down and we did a session, and we went through the process that I used to help release those parts. And it was a really powerful experience that takes some skill to do and takes some knowledge to do. Um, but it was very interesting when she was working with her parents, and she thought that these were her evil parents, right? I mean, it was like this. It's kind of like the abuser interject, right? The
Mm-hmm.
perpetrator interjects.
Yeah.
And what happened in the work was we found that those parents' soul, in her mind, was covered with this dark stuff. And once we were able to take the dark stuff off from them, she says, I saw the soul of my parents for the first time. Um, and that this dark stuff had to be then disposed of kind of properly. So in a sense, it's like a burden. So we don't have to make it too woo-woo that it's some kind. But there was this dark stuff that came in through the Nazi time,
Mm.
had really completely contaminated the way these parents were with their children,
Yeah.
right? and that it could be released. And after that, the parent soul could go the rest of the way on its journey because they were dead by then. And black stuff could be disposed of in a way that is not maybe totally unsimilar to the unburdening process in IFS, except that it seems to have a whole lot more energetic charge to it, right? So it's very useful if the person has strong spiritual connection that we can then bring into the process. In fact, when that happens, most often actually I'm working with people who have some kind of strong spiritual resources, guide energy that they can use to help them release that. You know, one of the things that I really truly believe is that when we are able to do this therapy work, the parts work therapy, and bring peace into the inner system, that we're bringing peace into the world. And we know that if we are engaging the world from a place where our parts are in harmony, then we are doing peace work, right? So to me, one of the ways that I know how to offer peace in the world is to help people to become peaceful with themselves. And so that's part of where I use the parts work, and I've used it in groups where we're healing the wounds of war. One of our groups was it was a powerful group of people who came together with the topic of healing the wounds of the Second World War. And so most of the people who came were people who, many of the people had family history of Nazi past, and they were working about coming into relationship with that. And then a number of people were Jewish people who had survived, somehow their families had survived the war and the country, but they had lost maybe 90% of their family or 95% of their family. And by coming together and using both, we invited everybody to bring some symbol of the burdens they were carrying from that time and a symbol of some resource that they brought, whether that was a spiritual resource or other resource at the beginning of it. And then on the second day, and then we kind of came together with the peace dances and the meditation and mindfulness and walking in nature, came back in. The next day we started working with the burdens they were carrying, and I worked with the parts work model to help them to come into self. And then the person I was working with was a bioenergetic therapist, so he kind of helped them to move another step of bringing that into the body work. And then we had a ritual for healing, and it was just a beautiful thing to see how these folks carrying the burdens of their SS ancestors and the tragedy of their families, and they could find this heart space to really begin to be released from those burdens and find healing. And to be able to, for the Jewish woman, one Jewish woman, she was able to say things directly to the Germans that she needed to say. And she needed to not whitewash it. She needed to not, pretend it wasn't there. At the same time that she could open a door for forgiveness in a way that would also free her. So it was a really beautiful thing. And then I did a similar one actually at a Vietnamese Buddhist monastery, where now I'm also the perpetrator ancestor of the Vietnam War, and carry that as well. So,
yeah. Do you feel comfortable sharing that story you had shared with me before about your dad? And
well, and that was so that was actually in the German group. One of the burdens that one person came is that her family lived in Dresden, and at the end of the war, the Americans completely destroyed Dresden in a firebomb that they very strategically created. And she lost 90% of her family in that firebombing. And it was so clear to me when we were in this round. My father trained bombers in the Second World War. So, it's very likely that one of the people that he trained was being part of this horrific devastation. And that we all carry responsibilities in various ways. And sometimes it's very immediate like that. And I have to work with my parts. My dad was so proud of that, and it was such a, not of the Dresden bombing, but he was proud of being part of the Second World War. And uh, finding that place where we can both understand how they could come there and how they could also not really understand the consequences of what they were doing. And then for me to look at, well, what do I need to do to come to peace with myself that's carrying part of the burdens um, of also a culture that's perpetrated actually atrocities for hundreds of years, and both in slavery and in what we've done to the native people who lived here before we came. I mean, we have not faced that history very much. In Germany, they have Holocaust memorials right in the center of Berlin. They have this huge memorial to the horrible things that they did, so they won't forget.
Wow.
Um,
And that's not
and
something we're
and
doing in America.
yeah. Have
Yeah.
you ever seen a memorial to the Holocaust we perpetrated on the Indians? Have you ever seen a major memorial to the deep trauma that we of slavery? We don't see it,
Yeah.
right? We don't see us coming to grips with our past,
Mm.
um, and it's something that I wish. And I think now, suddenly, in these last weeks, with the George Floyd protest, suddenly people seem to be aware, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
this still exists,
Yeah.
this disease of racism.
Yeah.
And so yeah, Dick wrote a very beautiful letter. I don't know if you saw the letter from Dick about what the IFS Institute is doing, and I was very impressed with that.
Yeah, yeah. I have a friend that does, she has a podcast for emotionally focused therapy, and she was like, I am jealous of what IFS is doing. Like, we're speaking up, and yeah, Dick is doing a great job. Yeah, so I feel really proud to be in this community for sure right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, it is a pretty white group.
Yeah,
I mean, you go to the conferences and it's, I mean,
yeah,
for all the efforts that are made, it still has
yeah,
remained a pretty white group. And I'm hoping that that can gradually shift. And I've really encouraged, I had a doctoral student who's African American, who really liked the parts work book and parts work model. And I said, could you please find someone who, or will you rewrite it so that it's more
mm,
relevant
yeah,
to the issues that exist? Because I would
yeah,
love to see it rewritten
yeah,
in a way that was addressing that population, just like it could be written for the Middle East. I'm working with people to rewrite it in
right.
something that will fit there. So um, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Can you tell me a little bit about your next book?
Well, one of the things that I do, it starts out with how my clients brought me to integrating spirituality into therapy. And I tell the story of the woman I was telling you about earlier. And then I had another woman I was doing parts work with, and it's in the last chapter of our book, chapter 8. And kind of the new book kind of starts where chapter 8 was. Where I was doing co-therapy with a therapist I was training in IFS. And after we did this unburdening, this child part had come out of this light, and my therapist turned around and said, well, the other therapist, can you ask that light what it is? Right. And I wouldn't have thought of that, actually. Ask the light what it
No,
is. Oh, all right.
no.
Right.
Yeah.
And she looked at the light, and it said, I am the window to your soul. And she started crying. And it was like this, there was this religious epiphany that happened when suddenly she says, I feel like I'm looking into the eyes of God. Right. And when that happened, the whole energy of her system changed. Right. It was like a flood of self energy into her and into us and into the room. And we all just sat there in sort of awe. And I thought, what was that? Right.
Wow.
And it was so powerful. I thought, if we can tap that energy,
Wow.
if we can help people access that, that's more important than anything else we can do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's how the experiences that I had with people of this sort of powerful change. And So I try to unfold a little bit about how you help in the book, how you're going to help people to access their particular um, resource. And it's not always going to be such a dramatic epiphany where
Right.
the person has basically some kind of a awakening moment of connecting with God.
Yeah.
But very often through the work, the person opens up in such a way that they do have very deep connections.
Well, and I love that asking the light what it is because I have this like the sun is my like often connects when I think of self energy and I
Hmm.
love the sun, but even just imagining putting my face to the sun and but I've never thought to ask what the sun is like what and I love that. I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah. And so um, it was funny when I was with Dick. It was so it's so funny. When back in the 80s, Dick had a couple of clients who had this really amazing guides, right?
Mm,
And uh, and he would say, "Well, could you ask him?" And then he'd give some philosophical question. Right? I've been wanting to know about this. Could you? What does your guide
wow.
think about this philosophical or this issue of life, the universe, and
Right.
everything? It was kind of funny
Right.
um, to
I
see
love
him
it.
do that. But it was like, wow, what is this? And what is it a resource? And there's incredible guidance there.
Right.
And so let's learn from it.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and we ask parts about parts. Like parts will tell us about other parts.
Right.
So that makes so much sense.
So when these other entities appear, these guides or whatever they are, um, that have this quality of, for me, the inner guidance are this really condensed self energy, right? That's what to me, the spiritual connections are. It's a very high density self
Mm,
energy, this
okay.
compassionate, loving, um, peaceful states that. And so I just want to kind of tell how this journey evolves and how I relate it to different cultures and how it arises in Christianity at times, how it arises in Islam, how it arises in Buddhism.
Do you have an idea of when the book is going to be out?
It's going to be at least a year, maybe a little more.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
disappointed. I'm like, I can't wait to
Yeah,
read
I
it.
know it. I know it. I really want it. It feels like it wants to be birthed. And so the other thing that's going on in my life that's major is I'm really working on setting up training centers in the Middle East. And one of the things that is my particular role, it seems like, is to go to those places where IFS can't yet afford to go, because it's a fairly expensive program to initiate in a new culture. So I in Egypt and in Jordan and in Lebanon, I've made connections, and I'm really working on training the trainers there and working together with them to develop these training models. And I'm also working in Germany to try and get my groups there to kind of do it after I'm done, because I'm not a spring chicken anymore, and it's clear that there's a limitation to how long I can do this. So
Mm,
I'm working at help. So I have this real struggle between finishing writing the book, and building these training systems
right,
over there.
right,
So, but in
right.
about a month, I'll have a little more free space, and I'll start working on it again.
Yeah, it's interesting though because you clearly are a teacher at heart, and part of being a teacher is spreading that, right? I teach you, and then you go teach, and that's what you're doing
Yeah,
now.
yeah, and I want people to find their voice. I don't want them to be just. I mean, one of the emphasis I call what I do often is parts work or internal systems therapy, and sometimes integrative internal systems therapy, because I like to really emphasize people building this into the other models of work. There's a lot of
Mm,
psychological knowledge and wisdom out there. IFS isn't the only way to understand things and the only way to intervene. It's a
mm,
very powerful one, and one of the things that when I found IFS, I was so happy because I could explain all of these very complicated things in object relations theory and psychodynamic concepts and um, uh, DBT concepts from Marshall Linehan. I could do that all in parts work language in a way that anybody can understand. That a 12-year-old, a
mm,
70-year-old who never studied psychology, anybody can understand it.
mm.
And parts work allows that to
I love
happen.
that.
Allows complex things to be described in simple language.
Yes.
And to me, that's one of the beauties of it. One of the things I've been trying to do now that I am not able to travel so much is I'm doing more videos. So I have a lot more videos on my website, which is wingedheart.org, not .com, but .org.
Okay.
And it's
Perfect.
Winged Heart, one word, you know, and it's kind of a strange title, but if you do Tom Holmes and Parts Work, eventually about the fourth one down on Google, you'll get to that website anyway, if you can't find it. And there I have a lot of videos that I'm doing now, some different meditations, and Lauri and I work with the cards on there in relationship to the COVID situation. That's where I have that little Grandpa Tom talks to his parts about COVID-19, right? So
That is so
um,
good. Oh my gosh, yes, I love that.
so
My son loved
it's a
that so
nice, fun
much.
little video, and
Yeah.
people all over the world are really enjoying it, and it gives me a part to use my uh, my puppet loving part to illustrate parts work. So I think that's the main thing, and people can get a hold of me just also with my email. I may get back sooner or later, but Tom Holmes, HOLMES 42 at gmail.com. So, and I respond if I can to people at times. And the other thing is, for therapists who are interested in the parts workbook, I do sell a discount for therapists. So I give, if people buy 5 or more, they get 25% off, which is,
Right.
they can get the book for like $15 instead of the $22. Now it's even 30% off. So they can write me directly. They can order that online on my website too.
Right.
So I have a lot of therapists. I have this one guy, every year he orders 60. I don't know how many new clients he takes a year. How can he be using these 60 or 90 books a year? But yes, Mark Weiss, he's down in Memphis. Man, I'll tell you, that guy is amazing.
Thanks,
And
Mark. Yeah.
yeah,
Great.
Mark, maybe he's just a great guy. And I was able to go down there and do a workshop with his folks last year, and he's
Oh,
just a
that's
super guy
great.
too. So.
Well, it sounds like the other thing for you is you have the freedom because you're not working with the IFS Institute. You have the freedom to
I can go
go
where I
and
want
do
to go. I
these.
don't have to
Yeah.
have a whole bureaucracy decide things. I decide and I go,
Yeah.
and I pay for when I'm working in the Middle East, I earn my money in Germany and I spend it for all my expenses, so people don't have to use their currency to pay for my costs. So
That's awesome, Tom. So my last question is, I think you're going to have a hard time answering it, but if you weren't doing all the stuff you're doing, what would you do instead?
probably what I would do would be to let go of the training
Mm,
and try to find a way to just be with people in opening up and awakening the heart space.
mm,
Just letting go of the training side of things. That's my non-dominant hand. That's my left hand, and
yeah.
and what I really love is finding ways to be together with people in a loving space and helping them to. It would still be healing the healer, but I guess
Mm,
it would be doing more healing the healer and tuning the heart of the healer, and letting IFS
mm,
support that, but really just resting in being held by this spirit of compassionate love that can hold us all.
mm,
So I guess I would do that if I didn't have this kind of training responsibility right now.
mm. I love that. Tom, thank you for everything you do. Thank you for your amazing book and cards. I love them. I know my clients love them.
Well, thank you, Tammy, and thank you for the work that you do in helping spread the IFS word around the world. It's lovely, and I've really enjoyed talking with you, and it helps
Thank
me to
you.
kind of hear my own story a little bit and to hear
Yeah.
what's important to me through your questions. So I appreciate that.
Mm. Thanks for hanging out today. If you liked this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFSTammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time. Today's episode was sponsored by Brighter Vision. What's the point of having a beautiful website if it doesn't attract the clients you want to see? As the worldwide leaders of website design for therapists, Brighter Vision sees this issue happen way too often. A nice looking website doesn't equate to a successful website. The truth is, your current website might even be turning off potential clients. That's where Brighter Vision comes in. Brighter Vision's team of website designers will create a website that is centered around attracting and retaining your ideal client so that you can have a nice looking website as well as a successful one. Better yet, Brighter Vision is offering $100 off exclusively for listeners of the One Inside podcast. To take advantage of this offer, simply go to brightervision.com/inside. Again, that's brightervision.com/inside.